tonight's Republican primary debate for South Carolina's 1st Congressional District. I'm Charles Bierbauer. Joining me this evening in the ETV studios here in Beaufort for questioning for the candidates are Gina Smith, projects editor of the Beaufort Gazette and the Island Packet, and Schuyler Croft, political editor at the Post and Courier and Palmetto Politics. The candidates joining us are the two Republicans running for the House seat, Jenny Horne and Mark Sanford. Before we begin, quick ground rules. Each candidate will have the opportunity to make a 1-minute opening statement, and from there we'll have up to 90 seconds to answer questions. If necessary, I'll allow a 30-second rebuttal. We do for the order for which the candidates will start. Congressman Sanford, we'll begin with your opening statement.
I would just thank you, Charles, and I guess the rest of you as hosts for hosting this gathering this evening, ETV in particular. I would thank every one of you who are tuning in for taking the time to listen and learn a little bit more about these campaigns and what they're about. I'm running for Congress because I believe that unless we get our financial house in order in Washington, D.C., there are going to be profound consequences in terms of the value of the dollar, in terms of inflation, and ultimately the American way of life. I think that I am worthy of consideration on this front because I've done exactly what I said I would do when I ran for this office just a couple of years ago. I've been rated at the top of the class, if you want to call it that, on a whole host of different ratings in the degree to which I've watched out for the taxpayer's wallet or purse, as the case might be, and I look forward to getting on those issues tonight.
Representative Horne.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say today is June 6th, and it's the 72nd anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And for the greatest generation of soldiers, freedom is not free. And I would like to thank all veterans tonight for your service. First of all, I'm running for office because Congressman Sanford does not represent the values of the 1st Congressional District. I am the daughter-in-law of a Korea and a Vietnam vet. I am the proud mother of a Navy junior ROTC freshman at Somerville High School who just got back from Paris Island and came back from camp and said, "Mom, I think I want to be a Marine." I'm a very proud mother and I care so deeply about the state. Congressman Sanford has tried to cut spending on the backs of our veterans and our troops. He voted on 4 occasions to close Guantanamo Bay so that those terrorists could come to the brig in Hanahan. That is against our interest in the 1st Congressional, and I strongly oppose his votes and look forward to serving you in Congress.
Let me start with questions to each of you about the kinds of experience that you would bring to this position. Representative Horne, you've served in the General Assembly. What do you translate from that to going to Congress in Washington?
Well, I think when you serve in the General Assembly in any capacity, it's about constituent service, number one. That first and foremost is my number one priority. It's to serve the issues and serve the interest of my constituents. Certainly, I am one of the hardest working representatives in Columbia. I have a very tough reputation for getting things done, and I'd like to take that attitude and the know-how and the knowledge and go to Washington and shake things up. With all due respect to Congressman Sanford, since he's been back in office, his voting record doesn't necessarily reflect the types of things that I would vote to cut, like military spending. And of course, the deficit has gone from 16 trillion to 19 trillion in just 3 years. So obviously Congressman Sanford is not getting the job done, and I think it's time for someone else to have a chance to shake things up in Washington. I know there are a lot of people that are really disappointed and sick and tired of what's going on in Washington.
Well, I'd like to focus on what you've done. Congressman Sanford has to defend his own record, but there's a sense that you've been catapulted into this position on the strength of one speech, an emotional one, a timely one, after the tragedy in Charleston. What's your legislative record that makes you a candidate for Congress?
First of all, as a freshman legislator, I was one of only 2 members of my freshman class to sponsor a bill that actually became signed into an act of law, and that was background checks for people who volunteer at public schools. I've had several records, a record of having the, one of the proudest legislative accomplishments I have is the having in-home care providers must be background checked, license bonded, insured. In South Carolina, there was a situation where someone had a significant theft and the person had no recourse because they weren't licensed, bonded, and insured. And now, thankfully, we can protect our seniors. My late father-in-law, we had to hire a caregiver for him, so I know what it's like to take care of seniors who need protection. And certainly I have focused my legislative service on protecting children, protecting the elderly, and looking out for our veterans.
Congressman, you're on your second go-round in Washington. What have you done this trip?
I've been a fierce advocate for the taxpayer. I think that, as Ms. Horne just pointed out, the debt continues to spiral. And unless we get our financial house in order, again, I believe there will be severe consequences for all of us as Americans. I would say that I have an unusual and unique perspective on that, given the fact that I was in Congress before. I was rated #1 in the entire U.S. Congress by the National Taxpayers Union in votes to limit federal spending and limit federal taxation. Similar rankings from Citizens Against Government Waste and a whole host of others. I think it's interesting that when I was governor, I was rated by the Cato Institute as the financially most conservative governor in the United States of America. I was the first governor to turn back stimulus money when I was in the governorship, because I saw then the corrosive effect that it would have with regard to other moral hazard in Washington or New York or elsewhere within the financial system. Since I've been back, I was asked to join, for instance, the Freedom Caucus, which is 40 folks that have been really pushing hard on this larger notion of government spending. So I think I bring a unique perspective with regard to trying to watch out for the taxpayer's wallet or purse. I also have a very important district perspective. When people are saying drill, baby, drill in Washington, D.C., I was gathering 30 colleagues from both sides of the aisle to join me in a letter to the administration saying, wait a minute, it does not make sense to drill off the coastal waters of South Carolina. And I think we were part of the formula to ultimately creating that change. I have a few other thoughts, but I see.
Well, I've looked at your campaign website, and it spends a lot of time talking about your time as governor, but not a lot about your time in Congress. So what I was looking for is something that's got the Sanford fingerprints on it.
Okay, well, I'll give you a few fingerprints. For instance, in the National Defense Authorization Bill just last week, I had 2 amendments that passed. One was tied to coordinating the way in which bullets are purchased in the training session for Army and Navy, and eliminating duplication such that there was a taxpayer saving. I had a similar amendment that was adopted on flyovers. I had an amendment that was not made in order at the Rules Committee, but I think would have passed with regard to New Balance shoes, and I think would amounted to an earmark. If you look at the Puerto Rico bill that was up and will come back up again this coming week in Washington, I had an amendment tied to minimum wage standard. What we do in places like the Northern Mariana Islands is allow them flexibility with regard to minimum wage standards so that it fits the prevailing wage of that region. Puerto Rico, given its locale in the Caribbean basin, does not fit with the minimum wage, for instance, that you'd find in suburban Chicago. And so what we have proposed is allowing them change so that they can become more competitive, so that they can ultimately pay part of the debt load that's there. We had an amendment, for instance, that went into law tied to the TSA. What we found in the TSA was people were being paid for roles that they hadn't qualified for. That made its way through the committee process, ultimately became law.
Thank you.
I could give you a few others. But
I'm sure you can,
okay.
but it's Gina Smith's turn. Gina.
Yes. Congressman Sanford, the Confederate flag is now off the State House grounds. Is this where we should stop? Should we can continue and remove other public monuments to the Confederacy?
I would say no. Ultimately, that won't be determined, and it should not be determined in Washington, D.C. I think that it ultimately should be decided at a state level, and different states will have different perspectives on that. But what I would say is this. The First Amendment is a fairly sacred thing. It means I can do something that you find totally objectionable, and you can do vice versa, and yet we still live in the same society with one another. And so the idea of taking down all monuments of the past, I think, would be a mistake, because the old saying is that those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. And whether we like it or not, it was indeed a part of our past. So it's one thing to take it down from the place where all folks come together to iron out differences, which is what a state capitol is about. It's an entirely different thing to take it away from places of memorials scattered across the state of South Carolina. So I would be opposed to it, though I don't believe I should be a decision maker. I think that needs to be decided at the state level.
Do you regret not working harder as governor to bring it down?
No, I had long conversations with Lonnie Randolph. If you recall Lonnie Randolph, he's head of the NAACP here in South Carolina. He is a dear personal friend. And we had, politics is the art of the possible. And, if you talk to Ms. Horne, if you talk to Governor Haley, you talk to anybody in the South Carolina, political sphere, just weeks before the tragedy that occurred at the AME Church, they would have said it's impossible. So, prior to my coming in, there had been a compromise that had been reached. It had been many years in the making. And my thinking at that time was you can spend the next couple of years trying to rehash that debate that's just come to a solution or to come to resolution, or you can work on issues that I think are important to black and white alike in South Carolina, which is, for instance, bettering the economy, which we worked hard on.
And Representative Horne, your thoughts? Have we gone far enough? Do we need to remove monuments elsewhere?
No, Gina, I actually agree with Governor Sanford on this issue. I think we can't rewrite our history. The big thing that was the distinguishing factor was this was a house that was paid for by taxpayers. It was the people's house. It offended some because it was flying as if it were a sovereign flag. And I think the flag needs to be in the Confederate Relic Room, and I've been to the Confederate Relic Room. And I embrace our history. I don't want us to rename streets and move monuments. I mean, that just seems just extreme. But again, the unique situation that we were faced with at the State House, I think, is its own unique and is not really something that we'll have to revisit again.
Mm-hmm. And you gave an impassioned speech on the House floor last summer calling for the removal. And during that speech, you said that you were a descendant of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Is that true?
Well, that's what my grandfather told me, Gina. And if you'll recall from that debate, we had 6 hours of debate, and there had not been one person to stand up and speak against the Confederate flag. Everyone who had gotten up before me to speak had talked about their grandfather fighting in the Civil War. So if you go back and look at 6 hours of debate, my frustration and my point was, it doesn't matter what your heritage is. It doesn't matter. I had relatives that fought in the Civil War. My grandfather told me I was a descendant of Jefferson Davis. In fact, that's how I was educated. He was very proud. He thought that that was the case, but we didn't have Ancestry.com in the 1970s when he told me this. And certainly, I've had people go out there and try to make a big deal and say I lied about it. No, being mistaken about something your grandfather told you is not. That we're all human, we all make mistakes, but I did not go out there and knowingly say that I was and that I wasn't. But I will tell you this, there is a James Jefferson Davis in our lineage. So back then when they put the names in the Bible, that's exactly how he made the mistake, because he got his lineage out of the family Bible.
Scotty Croft, question for Representative Horne.
Congressman Sanford voted with Democrats not too long ago to close Guantanamo, and you've taken that and made that as a leap that it also means sending those inmates potentially to the Navy brig in Hanahan. Can you really make that leap when the goal has been and Congress has said they shouldn't come to the U.S. and that they would go to other countries?
But that's not there. It's illegal right now, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be illegal in the future. Congressman Sanford, by voting against our interests, sent a message to the rest of the country that we want these terrorists here at the brig in Hanahan. We're number two. We're one of 2 sites that are currently being considered. So it is a very real possibility that if you vote to close Gitmo, those terrorists would be coming to the United States. We're just another defense authorization bill away from closing Gitmo and bringing those terrorists to the United States. I will fight against that, and no one will be mistaken about how we feel in the First Congressional. I stand with Governor Haley. She went to Washington and said she didn't want terrorists in South Carolina, and I fully support that. And the way you vote matters, because you're sending mixed signals, and we don't want terrorists at the brig in Hanahan, and I will fight against the closure of Gitmo.
Congressman, you explained your vote, but it also runs counter to the position of the rest of the delegation, and it sort of weakens South Carolina's voice if the Obama administration is looking for an end to use the brig in Hanahan. What do you say to that?
Again, the foundation of this argument is that Congress, again, House and Senate and White House, have signed into law 5 different times the fact that the president will not be able to move detainees from Guantanamo Bay to domestic U.S. and will not be able to close Guantanamo Bay, period. And I think that context is important. So last August, when this issue came up, I was out on CNN and a whole host of other TV outlets saying what the president's proposing here is illegal based on his own signature. And then I followed that up with a letter to the secretary. A delegation followed up with a letter to the secretary. But what I tried to point out in this Nadler amendment was obviously not bringing detainees from Guantanamo Bay to South Carolina. Nobody, again, representing the First District would espouse that viewpoint. But what I did try and raise was we need to have a conversation on indefinite detention. I don't think that it's consistent with American values to, unless you want to do harm to Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution and the Sixth Amendment, to house people for 20, 30, or 40 years, period. We've had finality going back to the D-Day, the day that we celebrate today. In the past, after past conflicts, in the wake of major conflicts, we've had military tribunals. We've had not the standard of evidence that's required in domestic cases, brought folks to trial, and then if they were found guilty, taken them out back and shot them. But there's finality to the process that does not do harm to the Constitution that I think indefinite detention does. So I voted that way to raise conversation. Perhaps I've gotten more conversation than I would have liked. That goes with the campaign season. But I think it's a very, very important debate because what's happened right now is Democrats have proposed just not dealing with it. They said, let's change the geography of indefinite detention. Republicans have said it's out of sight, out of mind. I think it needs to be brought to bear. I think it's a conversation we need to have as Americans.
Congressman, 6 years in Congress, 8 years in the governor's mansion. You're now looking at another 10 or 12 years potentially in Congress. You say you support term limits, but you aren't going to live them yourself. Aren't you becoming the career politician that you've railed against?
One, I said I will apply them to myself, but what I have said is that if you look at I think there are two considerations. One is I've signed on to every term limits bill that exists, and I've been recognized by U.S. term limits in my doing so. Two, I believe in the Jeffersonian model. You know, those guys came and went in and out of public life. The point is they weren't running from one office toward another. And I've never run, as you know, from one office toward another while holding office. And so I think it's important to have that taxpayer's perspective. That's what term limits are all about. And that's why I think it's relevant that, again, National Taxpayers Union, Citizens Against Government Waste, the different advocacy groups that say, are you watching out for the taxpayer, have recognized me on this front. And I think in contrast to my opponent, you know, I've gotten A's where she's gotten F's on this front. It's important, again, to have that taxpayer perspective. That is why, again, term limits are there. So I believe in them, have signed up for them. We'll self-prescribe them again. And again, I would use the model of our founding fathers who were involved in public life, many chapters of their life, but it wasn't, again, a continuous run. It was leaving one thing, going to do another, coming back to the farm, going and run for another.
What is your term limit now?
What's that? I've said 12.
12.
Yeah.
Do you want to rebut that? You had.
I would like to respond because Congressman Sanford is real proud of all these scores he's getting, but none of these think tanks are scoring on military and national security issues. So the only score that I care about, I don't look at a score sheet and say, oh, well, gee, I'm going to vote this way. I'm going to vote what's right and what's right for the people in my district. So the only score that matters to me is a score that I get on June 14th in the Republican primary.
Did you want to add also on term? Did you want to ask Representative Horne about term limits, please?
I am a proponent of term limits, albeit I'm not running for office. After 8 years in the South Carolina General Assembly, I very well could have filed for both offices. There was nothing prohibiting me from doing that, but I was not going to run for re-election, even if I did not decide to run for Congress. So yes, I'll support a term limits bill. I'll sign whatever. I'll sign on to any bill that we have in term limits and vote for it because I believe in term limits and my record demonstrates that.
What would be your self-imposed term limit for Congress?
12 years. Continuous, so. Not coming back and starting over.
I want to bring you both back to Cuba for a different aspect of it. Congressman, you went to Cuba with President Obama. 3 weeks ago, I went with the president of the university. But things are changing there rapidly. So give me a sense, if you could, and I'll ask you each this, starting with the congressman, of what are the opportunities that you see in Cuba? What potential benefits could there be for your district and all of South Carolina?
I think for me, the economic issues on this one are secondary to the liberty issue. There are but 11 million people that make up the population of Cuba, and so from the standpoint of it being an economic juggernaut in terms of trade, it probably isn't that. Are there opportunities in terms of agricultural exports and other things? Yes, but that's not what got me interested in this issue. What got me interested in this issue is, again, Jefferson said that the normal course of things was for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield. And so what's happened is I began to learn about this issue was that you or I can travel to any country in the globe. You could go to Iraq, you could go to Iran, you could go to Syria, you could go to North Korea, a lot of crazy places out there. It may not work out well for you, but you go to any place in the globe except for one, and that's Cuba. And so as we begin to look at it, we said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense from the standpoint of American liberty. This is not the former Soviet Union where you have to get your papers, where government tells you you can and can't go. And there may have been a strategic reason and a military reason to do so back in the 1960s, but that's not where we are right now. And so really for me, it was pushback against, again, a government policy that was outdated, didn't make sense, and it was contrary to what we've done in terms of foreign policy with so many other places in the world, whether that's Vietnam or China or go down the list. We've chosen engagement, and it's paid off both economically and from a liberty standpoint. I think the same could apply in Cuba.
Should the U.S. trade embargo be lifted?
That's a more delicate question. I mean, all I've said at this point, I think Americans have the ability to pick and choose where they go. There is a bill, it's Tom Emmer's bill, that would completely lift the sanctions. I've not signed on to that at this point.
Okay. President Horne, what are the pros and cons of opening up greater opportunities with Cuba as you see them?
I think we need to proceed with caution, and I think going to Cuba with President Obama sends a message that we want to close Gitmo, and I don't want to close Gitmo. I want Gitmo to stay right where it is, and the Geneva Convention controls enemy combatants. They don't have the rights that American citizens have. It's a communist country, so I think we have to be very, very careful in opening up any kind of relationship, whether it's trade or otherwise, with Cuba until we know how we're going to protect our country, and people coming through Cuba could be a risk to our national security. And I think it's very important that we proceed with caution.
What about the trade embargo?
I would not be in favor of lifting the trade embargo at this time. I think we need to be worried about matters of national security first and foremost.
Let me try it this way. The Canadians are in Cuba, the Latin Americans are in Cuba, the Europeans are in Cuba. Is the United States missing out on something there? Primarily from a question of tourism and trade. We're a tourism state.
We are, but we have a port in Charleston, and if we have terrorists that are coming through Cuba and putting things on cargo ships that are coming into the United States, particularly the port of Charleston, that concerns me. And I want to make good and sure that that's not going to happen. But so we need to, like I said, we need to proceed with caution. And I think you can't have complete economic free-for-all in Cuba when you're dealing with a communist dictator and people that we don't know how they're coming in and where they're going and what their intentions are.
Do you share the Congressman's view that the economic benefits might be relatively small?
The economic benefit?
I think if I understood the Congressman, you said you didn't think it would be all that big a deal.
Right.
I really don't. I don't have an opinion on that. My opinion is national security is the first and foremost issue vis-a-vis Cuba.
Okay. Gina Smith?
Representative, I think it's fair to say that one of the big themes of your campaign is that the congressman has not been a friend to veterans in the district. What would be your proof?
Congressman Sanford was one of 4 Republicans that voted against the Veterans Access, Choice, and Accountability Act of 2014, which would have allowed VA veterans to who waited longer than 30 days to go outside of the VA network and see a private physician. My father-in-law was a Korea veteran and a Vietnam veteran, and he obtained he was exposed to Agent Orange, and I have dealt with the VA quite a bit. And he earned every benefit that he got from the VA because he ultimately gave his life for his country. So veterans are very important to me, and Congressman Sanford can talk about cutting budgets, but you're not going to cut them. You should not cut it. It's immoral to cut it on the backs of our soldiers, the backs of our veterans, and we need to fulfill the commitment that we made to our veterans so long ago. And I feel very strongly about that.
So what would be your reaction, Congressman? She mentions the $16.3 billion bill to overhaul the Veterans Affairs Administration, and you are, I think, one of 5 House Republicans who voted against it. Was this to you just, you're sticking with that campaign promise basically about?
No, let's back up and look at the larger context as it relates to military and or veterans votes. Since I've come back, there have been 4 National Defense Authorization bills. I voted for 3 of the 4. Since I've come back, there have been 4 veterans appropriation bills. I voted for 4 of the 4. The one bill that she's citing is this choice bill, which was I voted for at the House level. It went over the Senate. When it came back in committee, the interesting part was that they did not pay for 10 of the $16 billion in funding. 10 of the $16 billion. So I think that if you're going to honor a promise to veterans, you better make sure you're actually paying for the bill as opposed to saying, tell you what, we'll get our kids and grandkids to pay for it, or we'll get somebody else to pay for it. If it's that big a priority, why wouldn't you pay for it? So, you know, the chance to vote no is a chance to say, no, we could do this bill a bit better. It's not to say we disagree with the idea of choice. I mean, I love the idea of the 40-mile radius. I love the idea of the wait line was too long, having access to physicians on the private care side. But the issue was the culture. We were throwing money at the problem, but not fixing the culture. And I think I've been vindicated in my viewpoint, given the comments most recently of Bob McDonnell, who is, as you know, the Secretary at Veterans Administration. He likened the lines at a veterans hospital to the lines at Disneyland. So some returning soldiers lost an arm or a leg or maybe even both, waiting at a veterans hospital is equated to a kid waiting at Disneyland for Space Mountain or the Magic Kingdom. I think we still have a culture problem in terms of accountability of the veterans hospital system, and that's why I voted as I did, in addition to $10 billion of that $16 billion not being paid for.
So what would you say to that, Representative? $10 billion of the $16 billion, who knows where the money's going to come from? I mean,
well, somebody should have offered an amendment to fund the $16 billion instead of just voting against the bill. I'm sorry, the veterans are most important. We can cut entitlement programs elsewhere. So I look forward to working on some real solutions when I go up there, but I am not cutting on the backs of our veterans or our troops or the military and national defense. Congressman Sanford has voted against military spending, cutting military spending every chance he gets. He votes with President Obama. And that to me is just un-American.
If I might respond to my opponent on this one, what you're saying suggests a complete misunderstanding of the process in Washington. I voted for the bill in House. At the House level, it is amendable. But when it's gone over the Senate, come back in conference report, you have a non-amendable bill. You can either vote yes or you can vote no. You do not have the opportunity to say, I would like to do this amendment to a conference report.
Skylar Croft.
Congressman, why should someone who makes the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour support you?
Because that's the person I've most looked for in my entire time in politics. The person with nothing more than maybe a John boat in the front yard who lives in the simplest of settings. That is the silent majority in the American political system. You know, the well-off will always be taken care of. Big corporations will always have a voice, a lobbyist at the table. But it is that silent majority that Amity Shalais writes about that is really not accounted for and not represented. And that's why I think the leadership that I've expressed over a long period of time in terms of trying to advocate the taxpayer's viewpoint is very, very important. So I would say those are the folks who say, leave me alone. I want government out of my life. I don't want government interfering in my life. And I've tried to do just that.
Same question.
Well, I find it odd that Congressman Sanford cares about the minimum wage in Puerto Rico because I have no idea what that's got to do with the interest of the First Congressional. So, you're right, there is a silent majority. There's a silent majority of people who are sick and tired of what's going on in Washington. And one of the problems is we need serious campaign finance reform, because I'll tell you that the money has completely corrupted Washington and has corrupted the process. So certainly I believe very strongly that on June the 14th the voters will send a message, and they have a choice. And we challenge our incumbents to hold them accountable for their votes. And Congressman Sanford can explain everything away, but the fact of the matter, your voting record is your voting record, period.
Congress, you want to respond on that?
Yeah, I would just say Puerto Rico really matters to South Carolina, because we have an incredible swath of retirees, literally going from Myrtle Beach down to the islands of Hilton Head and Bluffton, not far from us, on up to the mountains. And many of those retirees, or many of the people that retired as teachers within the state system, count on municipal bonds and paying for part of their retirement. But what's happening in Puerto Rico has real ramifications for the $3.7 trillion municipal market in this country. And if they are allowed simply a bailout that changes what it means to say full faith and credit in a bond, it has implications for Illinois, for California, for a bunch of other states that have gotten ahead of themselves with regard to spending. So I think it matters, and our amendment was about saying, might we look at alternatives other than a bailout, other than changing the rule of law, that would allow Puerto Rico to be more competitive in paying for its debt load, and the minimum wage change, I think, was part of the formula.
Representative Horne, the issue of women being subject to a selective service military draft is sure to come up in the next few Congresses. What is your position on the issue, and do you see female members of the service being physically on par with their male counterparts and eligible for frontline service?
Well, I have decided that, yes, I think that registering for a selective service, now that they've opened up every combat opportunity for women, they don't have any restrictions on their ability to promote in the military. And I think that if I have a son and I have a daughter, and both of them, my son will register for selective service, and there's no reason why my daughter shouldn't register for selective service. But the fact of the matter is we haven't had a draft since Vietnam. So I am in favor of women having the same advancement opportunities in the military. And now that they have been opened up to combat, I mean, you've got women that are certainly a lot stronger. Even Congressman Sanford admitted it in his comments about this issue. Yes, women are capable of doing and bringing something powerful to the military, because you have officers, you have very skilled officers in the military, and why would you not open up these opportunities to 50% of our population? I say we're a stronger military and we're a safer country because women have the full opportunities that our men do in uniform, and I thank them for their service.
Congressman, you've said your thinking on this is kind of Neanderthal. Can you explain that, what your position is?
I think that Secretary of Defense Ash Carter is making a real mistake with what he's jamming on the military. The Marines resisted this very, very strongly. So we have many Marines around us. Marine Corps Station Beaufort right around the corner, Parris Island. The Marines pushed back real hard, saying, if you look at the infantry numbers in terms of basic, the pass-fail rate does not bode well with regard to this standard. The reality is this is not the place for social engineering. God makes us different. It is not to say that man is better than woman or vice versa. It is to say he made us different. And if you look in the elite unit, SEAL Team 6, it is not a question of are there not women that couldn't take care of me? Absolutely. I'm sure you could find a list of them that would have physical superiority relative to me or Charles or you. But the issue is with the elite versus the elite, how will they do against a Russian commando who is the elite in his scale? And so, I mean, if you want to socially engineer this and see if women can meet the same standards, make half the NFL integrated, half male, half female, and the other half all male, and let's see which teams win. There are clear physical differences. This is not to say that women don't have a role in the military. They absolutely do. It is just to say that within SEAL Team 6, in the elite of the elite, they will not have the same physical prowess, and the Marine Corps studied this, and their documents, I think, absolutely magnify this point, They will not be able to perform at the same level that men, and therefore I think this is a mistaken notion.
Congressman, I'm going to pick
Yeah,
up
sure.
right where you left off, because I wanted to ask more about the military.
Yeah.
And the military is evolving. It's not just about women being in the same roles in combat, but we're seeing the whole technological assessment of where things are headed. The story today in the news, it says the Air Force isn't going to seek a follow-on fighter to the F-35. The F-35 is now deployed as well here in Beaufort. The Air Force is not building more C-17s, the ones that fly out of Charleston. So as the military evolves, what do you see the future role for South Carolina with the bases that we have here? What's going to change?
I couldn't attempt to predict the change other than what they say, the
Well,
military experts say,
what
is
would
that.
you like to change?
What's that?
What would you like to change, if anything?
Well, the one thing about history is we don't know what comes next. But what we do know is the constant in military technology is it's constantly changing, and we have to update and change with it. Which is to say that past is prologue in what I did as governor, to use that as a reference point. You know, we actually gained billets during my time as governor. We put together a commission. We told the story of South Carolina, told how we had unique, for instance, airspace. We had a number of unique capacities that other places didn't have. And if you compare us to, for instance, Alabama, Alabama lost 11 facilities in the last BRAC. California, Pennsylvania, Texas lost more than that, but I don't know that they're comparable given the size. The military folks that I talk to say this is probably the last round of manned tactical fighter. What that means in terms of what comes next in drones and drone-like air combat capability, I don't know. But I would say I did I think a respectable job of shepherding us through the last BRAC process, and I'd like to help shepherd South Carolina's story as it relates to the DoD budget going forward.
BRAC being the base reduction. Representative Horne, I'd like to ask you, as South Carolina looks forward with the military presence here, what sort of things do you think are important for the state to be anticipating, doing, preparing for?
Well, I think that if we have another BRAC, and it's probable that South Carolina is vulnerable. We've lost some jobs at Fort Jackson in Columbia that's cost a lot of money to our economy in the state of South Carolina. As your next Congresswoman, I would be opposed to any closure of any of our military installations in South Carolina or any further reductions. And I think it's very important that you have a strong advocate in Washington who's going to fight to keep those military installations open. I think that we're very concerned in our area, in the First Congressional, of losing the only base that we have in South Carolina that is a certainty that would never close is Parris Island. So we have to be very vigilant. And I know Congressman Sanford has been quoted in the newspaper as saying he supports a BRAC, but Senator Tim Scott and I both agree that we would not support a BRAC if it impacts our bases in South Carolina.
To try and fend off the BRAC, the General Assembly has just passed legislation that would allow military retirees living in South Carolina to not pay or to pay a reduced tax burden on income tax. That's the sort of thing that's been crafted to fend off any kind of assertion that South Carolina is military friendly.
Yes.
Is there any reason to think that people who look at this state would not think this is military friendly?
Well, I think that by passing the bill in the General Assembly, and we passed it unanimously, we're sending a very strong message to our retirees who've served at least 20 years before they retire that their military pay is exempt from taxation in South Carolina. It says to our base, to our installations, it says to our veterans, there's 65,000 veterans living in the First Congressional District with a huge economic impact. It says thank you for your service, and we appreciate what you have done, and we want the military bases to stay here so we can continue to serve our veterans and have Joint Base Charleston and we don't want detainees at the Brig and Hanahan, because then that could jeopardize SPAY War and the operations there. So no, I've been to visit every base in the First Congressional District, and I know how very important it is to our economy, and we need a congresswoman that's going to fight for us in
What's the
Washington.
cost of that tax break, which I don't think the governor has yet signed, but is certainly likely to? And how do you replenish that? How do you offset that?
I don't know exactly what the tax break number is, but this is something we've been working on for a long time, and it's something we've needed to do for a long time. So we can make up the revenue elsewhere, and certainly we have other less important programs that we fund. I think this is a very important part of our policy, public policy in South Carolina.
Congressman, thoughts on that?
Again, there's a military enhancement committee that has done, I think, a very good job of looking at pieces of legislation that would enhance the desirability of our bases relative to other bases. I think Bill Bethea down at Hilton Head has done a spectacular job on that front. I would say, again, we have a unique story to be told in South Carolina. If you think about the era of rapid response and air movement, I mean, the C-17s in Charleston are very, very well positioned. If you think about this notion of air superiority, there aren't many places on the Atlantic eastern seaboard that have what we have for the Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, with offshore range as well as the Townsend range down in Georgia, which we just added to. If you think about, again, Parris Island, how many oceanfront islands that are sequestered happen to be on the east or Gulf Coast of the United States of America? There's only one that's left, and it's Parris Island. If you think about, the nuclear sub-school, I mean, we have a lot of unique functions, and I think that things like the credit from the standpoint of retirement are things that further enhance the South Carolina story. But I don't think we should be frightened of what might come next based on, I think, how compelling the story is with South Carolina facilities.
Thank you. Gina.
Let's move on to offshore drilling. Drilling for oil and natural gas has been taken off the table for now, but seismic blasting to explore for resources could still happen. Do you think the exploration is worth the potential environmental cost?
No, Gina, I don't, and I support the position that we have taken here in the First Congressional, and that is that we do not want offshore drilling, and we do not want seismic testing because it could damage our fisheries, which is so vital to our economy here in South Carolina.
What about the argument that if these resources are found, that it could be such an economic boon?
Well, the likelihood of there being oil found off the coast of South Carolina is almost slim to none. There may potentially be natural gas, but I don't know that it's enough to really make a huge difference. So I would say I respect our ecosystems and the economy that we have here in South Carolina, and certainly would not support that, and certainly would make sure that South Carolina's coastline continues to be pristine and beautiful and a big part of our economy, especially our tourist economy.
Mm-hmm. And this would be one area then you disagree with Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, two names you brought up earlier.
Yes.
Okay. Congressman?
I think the question is not whether or not we believe in it, the question is will we lead on it? And I think that that's what stands out about my actions as it relates to offshore drilling and offshore testing. I was the first person in the South Carolina delegation to come out against the offshore. I ultimately, as mentioned earlier, got more than 30 other members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, to join me in a letter to the administration suggesting that it didn't make sense. We held any number of different town hall meetings. We joined in with people like Billy Keisling, who's a Democrat, here the mayor of Charleston, or for that matter, the mayor, newly elected mayor, John, up in Charleston, in terms of looking at ways wherein we might have additional influence with the administration, given their Democratic leanings and my Republican. And so I think we've worked it from a lot of different angles. I think that is important, whether it's a conversation with John Tecklenburg in Charleston, or again, Billy Keisling here in Beaufort, to look for ways of reaching across the aisle on something that is important as this. I think it's also important to note that, in my second run for governor, I was endorsed by the Sierra Club. There are no other second-term Republican governors that were running for re-election that were endorsed by the Sierra Club, but they did so because of the way in which I was willing to lead on environmental issues that I think particularly fits with the flora and fauna, if you will, of the coast of South Carolina. We live in a very special place. I mean, you're down there in Bluffton, and you know how a lot of people come to this part of the world or have stayed in this part of the world because of the unique look and feel of the Low Country. And I think it's important that we retain that. That's why I think leadership on this particular side is awfully important.
You've still got a minute if you want it.
What else can we do in terms of pushing back on seismic blasting?
Same process that we went through on the lease itself. It's the squeaky wheels that get greased in politics. There is no particular science to it. It is raw political might and voice that matters. I think you go through the same exercise in having conversations with people who might have more influence than I would as a Republican in a Democratic administration. That's why I use the example of whether it's Billy Keisling here in Beaufort or John Tecklenburg up in Charleston. I think you do things like that. But other than that, it's again, squeaky wheels get greased in politics. It's making noise on it continually, but there's no science to it.
Scott.
Donald Trump is going to become the Republican nominee. When he was in Charleston, he called for a ban on Muslims coming into the country. He's also said that he plans on getting Mexico to build a wall to stop immigration. Do you consider these well thought out ideas, and do you endorse them? And if you were elected, would you help him make this happen?
Well, first of all, I don't control what Donald Trump says to the media, of course, but I support the Republican nominee because the people have spoken. That is our Republican nominee, and that's who we'll support. Do we need to secure our borders? Yes, but we need to secure our southern border as well as our northern border. We need to make sure we know who's in the country. We need to make sure we know the intention of the people moving into the country. And right now, there are so many people here that we just don't know who's coming in, and the breaches are coming from the Canadian border that are impacting national security as well. So yes, I think we need to have some sort of visa check system so we know every person who is here in the United States, why they're here, for what length of time they're supposed to be here. When you go to Europe, you have to do that. And I think European countries do a heck of a lot better job than we do in knowing who is here in our country. So yes, I would support we knowing who are here in this country and why they're here.
Do you support Mr. Trump on these positions?
I support Mr. Trump's position that we secure our borders and that we know who's here. And we don't just let people in without knowing what their intentions are, and they have to be properly vetted.
Same question.
No, there are a whole host of things I vehemently disagree with Donald Trump on. He says some crazy stuff, and that's what gives a lot of us pause with regard to his candidacy. I've said ultimately I will support the Republican nominee, but it's not without a lot of soul searching. I mean, Micah 6:8 says that we're to walk humbly before our God and the people around us. The book of Proverbs is filled with all kinds of adages on the notion of humility in the process of leadership. And so whether it's that or 20 years of life lessons teaching your boys you don't need to tear somebody else down to build yourself up. I mean, there are a lot of things that make one scratch one's head. I mean, the latest would be his comments on the judge. I mean, they're contrary to 200 years of tradition in the United States where we judge you based on what you do, not who your father was. The idea that any of us, based on genealogy, are prescribed in terms of what we're going to do next in life is the opposite of what the American experiment is all about. So I think he says a number of things that are very, very strange, some of which are destructive. And I guess my pledge would be to work with him on areas of agreement and to disagree on areas where you don't. I mean, I think that's what you're supposed to do in representing any particular geography, in this case, representing the 750,000 people that make up the First Congressional District of South Carolina.
What would be your plan then for the 13 million illegals that are in the country?
Well, I've said it for a long time. I think the first step is securing the border. So again, I would applaud Donald Trump. I don't know that he's going to get the Mexicans to pay for it, but at least the sentiment of the first thing you got to do is secure the border. I mean, I think that one of Ronald Reagan's great regrets was, the Missoula-Simpson language of 1986. That was a de facto amnesty for about 3.5 million folks with the promise that security would come later. The amnesty took place, the security never did. And he said that was one of my great regrets. So I think you got to reverse it. You got to secure the border first. Then I'd say, secondly, you've got to look at, I think, a robust guest worker program that allows people for some of these basic trades and basic needs to come and go. We had that with the Becerra program from 1946 to 1964 in this country, and it worked awfully well. I'd say couple that with you got to hold the president back with regard to executive amnesty, and I've taken a whole number of different votes on that very front. And finally, I think you probably need to have a robust E-Verify. I think it matters that when I was governor, we signed into law one of the most effective E-Verify systems in this country, and I think we need it nationwide.
Same question.
I agree. I support E-Verify. When I was in the General Assembly when Governor Sanford was governor, and certainly I think that Governor Sanford and I probably agree on immigration pretty well. So I would say there's no real big distinction between the two of us. The concerns that I have are with those that I've already previously stated.
I wanted to ask you about Donald Trump as well, but we held it off till the end here. I heard two people say, each of you say, that you would support the nominee. I didn't hear any sense of enthusiasm. Is Donald Trump, let me start with you first, Ms. Horne, is Donald Trump hurting the Republican Party?
You know, I would say that Donald Trump is growing the Republican Party. If you look at our voter turnout in South Carolina, newly registered Republicans came out and voted in historic numbers. So I think that what Donald Trump is appealing to is the anger and frustration that a lot of us feel here in the United States, that there is a complete disconnect between Washington insiders and the rest of the citizens who run their businesses every day and make payroll and pay their taxes and work and employ people. And we're getting more and more mandates from the federal government, and quite frankly, Congressman Sanford's part of that. And certainly, I think we need new people in Washington, and I think one of the reasons why Donald Trump is doing so well is that he is not beholden to special interest groups, and he's funding his own campaign, and that's got some Washington establishment folks very nervous. So I think it's very important for us to talk about the money and the special interest groups that are running Washington.
Let me rephrase the question to you. Is Donald Trump helping or hurting the Republican Party?
Time will tell. And I say that in that he is yin and yang. He's both sides of the equation. And which one ultimately prevails from the standpoint of help or hurt will play out as this thing goes through. So on the one hand, you have to applaud, as Ms. Horne just pointed out, the fact that he's tapping into people's absolute frustration. I mean, Washington or Columbia or a lot of other capitals around this country aren't working for people. People are scared, they're hurting, and they're saying, I just want to see a change. I mean, if we keep going the route we're going, something's going to break and it's going to be on me. And so there's a message. I had this conversation with some folks down at Sun City some months ago, and they said, I just want to send a message to Washington that I want China broken, not the country, but it's in T and China broken. And so part of it he's tapping into that. Part of it he's tapping into is people's absolute frustration with executive branch overreach from the standpoint of the Obama administration. So he's doing those two things that creates a real energy. But on the other hand, he's doing these strange things, as I mentioned, for instance, with the judge just a couple of days ago, that are absolutely destructive from the standpoint of the Republican Party standing for people of all races and all walks of faith. I think he, for instance, with Governor Martinez, I was once Republican chairman of the Republican Governors Association. She holds that chair now. She happened not to go to one of his rallies in New Mexico, and so what's he do? He tees off on her. This is, mind you, the woman who is chairman of the Republican Governors Association. So I think that there is a petulance, if you will, to some of the way he approaches things that leaves hanging in the balance as to whether or not he'll be a plus or a minus in the long run. But what I do know...
We've got 2 minutes left.
I'm sorry.
I want to end on this race, not the presidential race. So 1 minute each. Give me one big thing that you, first Congressman, think you can bring about.
I don't know whether
It
I'll
could
be
be
able to bring it
economic, it could
about.
be
Yeah, I don't
social,
know
but
whether I'll be able to bring it about or
give us
not.
that one big
But
thing.
I know the reason I'm running is the reason that I ran, which is we are approaching a tipping point in this country wherein if we don't get our financial house in order, we will have severe problems in terms of inflation, the value of the dollar, and ultimately the American way of life and the opportunity that it provides. People get it at a gut level. That's why when polled, a lot of people say, I'm not sure my kids are going to do as well as I did. The essence of the American dream is believing that I did so well, my kids will do better.
Got one big thing you want to leave us with?
Campaign finance reform is a must. The money has corrupted the system so bad. It's awful. Everyone I've talked to just has a very anti-incumbent attitude, and I will get up there and I will be a strong advocate for cutting entitlements in other areas and staying away from defense spending and cutting our body armor for our troops. I mean, if my son is going to be a soldier, and he will likely be a soldier one day, I want to make sure that when we put him on the battlefield, that we give him the tools that he needs to successfully complete the mission. And of course, I love this state. I've lived here all my life, and I think that I can do a better job than Congressman Sanford.
We're going to let it at that. There's no rebuttals at this point of the evening, but thanks to you both. Thanks to our candidates, Jenny Horne and Mark Sanford. Thanks as well to Gina Smith and Skylar Croft for joining me. And for everyone at ETV, thank you for being with us. Get out and vote. I'm Charles Bierbauer. Good night.